Okay, so now we're going to talk about Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality, which is published in 1972. It's a very famous contemporary work in consequentialist moral philosophy. And Peter Singer is a philosopher who is still alive and still working today and works in a lot of applied philosophy. So this is an example of applied ethics, which means that it is taking the theory of philosophy and saying, let's examine a particular issue and say how this theory would guide us into action. So he begins this paper by discussing a famine occurring in Bengal at the time of the writing. Like I said, it's in 1972. And he goes on to provide a series of numbers, just facts and figures, describing how much countries are contributing to famine relief as compared to other sort of seemingly frivolous or self-interested or otherwise not very morally important things. For example, he describes how Australia contributed 1/12 of what they used to build the Sydney Opera House to famine relief. So he sets all this up, and then he asks us to consider the moral implications of this kind of situation. And this is essentially to show us that there's something very, very wrong with the moral standards in these relatively affluent countries that allow for this kind of reactional response to really like severe humanitarian crises. And he says this means that the way that we think about moral issues and that our whole conceptual schema needs to be altered because this is just such a morally egregious failure that something has to be done. So his argument here, is very straightforward. It's very simple. And it goes like this. Premise 1 is that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And he says, I'm not going to argue for that. Just if you have like an odd belief that it's not bad, you feel free to argue for that. But he says, I'm not going to argue for that. I'm going to take that as assumed. And then he says, following from this, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. So this premise 2, this is the conclusion of his argument, and this is his sort of main point that he's trying to set forth in this article. And this is a principle that's really heavily cited, it's really heavily discussed in moral philosophy. But he also offers a more moderate formulation of this principle. That is very clear throughout the paper that he endorses this stronger one. But the moderate position goes like this. Quote, if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. So as you can see, the bar for action here is higher. He changes the language from just bad to very bad. And the demands on us are lower because we only have to act if we can avoid giving up something of, we don't have to act if we are required to give up anything morally significant at all, not just something of equal moral importance, like in the stronger formulation. But a few times in the article he says that he really can't think of a reason to endorse this weaker proposal over the stronger one. So remember, the stronger position is like this, quote, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. And this is the guiding principle that he uses. But he offers a few more clarifying points about sort of what the details are, what he sort of means. And he says, the first one is this. He says that this principle does not take into account proximity or distance. These aren't morally relevant features of a situation. So, for example, it makes no moral difference whether the person you're helping is someone you know or someone who lives in your neighborhood, or it's someone tens of thousands of miles away, someone across the earth who you will never see, you may never know. And so that one he says if you accept like any sort of notion of impartiality or universalizability, like most moral systems tend to involve, then this should be pretty obvious to you. This should be pretty intuitive. But he says his second point is this. He says, according to his principle, it also makes no difference whether you are the only one who can do something about a moral issue, or you are just one among millions of people who could act similarly and make a sort of similar amount of difference. So it doesn't matter if you are just like one among 10,000 other people who could all do the same thing but aren't. And this second one is sort of he says it's less obvious, but the gist of it is that you can't really wriggle your way out of moral obligation just because other people aren't doing anything either. So he says, quote, "I admit that there is a psychological difference between the cases. One feels less guilty about doing nothing if one can point to others similarly placed who have also done nothing. But this makes no real difference to our moral obligations." So he's saying, listen, that just isn't a very good excuse. And it kind of like when Mill distinguishes between motivations and what our obligations are, it's like, listen, that might be at work psychologically or motivationally, but our moral obligations are still the same. And there's something I should also mention about this first point about proximity or distance that's really relevant as our technologies of communication have become even more advanced. So he says, look, the only way that proximity or difference might make a difference for us is that it might be easier to know what is needed, know what is sort of like morally required or would be a useful action for things that are closer to us, just because it might be easier to have knowledge about those sorts of things. But he says, as our technology gets better, as our communication gets better, that excuse doesn't really hold up because we can see often what is going on across the world, or we can be in communication with people who are there. And so I think that's an interesting thing to think about, what that means for us morally, what our communication and technology means for us morally. Could be something to bring up in a discussion post, but that is also worth mentioning. He does bring that up. Okay, so those are the sort of basic details of his argument. And he brings up a few objections. And the first one is that this just might be too much of a radical revision of our current moral scheme. He says people don't ordinarily judge moral issues by this standard, and most people reserve moral condemnation. They reserve saying, like, you have failed morally or you've done something morally bad for people who have violated some moral norm. So, for example, a moral norm against stealing, someone is a thief, and people say, that's bad, you acted morally bad, etc. And his reply to this is that the way people do judge situations has nothing to do with how they should judge moral situations. So facts about what is normal in society don't really come to bear on what is actually the moral thing to do or what is morally ideal. And so by means of explaining why people tend to judge moral situations the way they do, he cites J.O. Urmson, who says that people come up with the moral principles that they then endorse, or they obey the moral principles that they do based on concepts about what it is required to live together in society. So we can't live together peacefully in polite society if we're all just constantly murdering each other and stealing from each other, etc. And so he says people tend to then just endorse or say that what is moral is just what's required to sort of live together peacefully. So related to this first objection is a sort of critique brought on by several philosophers who say that our moral code shouldn't go too far beyond the capacities of a normal person. And this is brought up as a critique of utilitarianism more broadly, just that maybe it's too demanding, and that what can happen is that when the demands are too high, people feel that they can't really meet any of them, and so they just kind of give up. They say, well, I'm not going to be moral anyway, so I'm just not going to obey any moral principles because why even try? So that you can do with that what you will. But that is a critique not just of this account, but of other accounts of utilitarianism. Okay, so the second critique is that it would require us, this principle would require us to like work around the clock, all of us to work around the clock to increase the balance of happiness over misery in the world, and that this is just too much. But he says, listen, this might not be the case all the time based on his theory, because he offers a very specific calculus of what is involved and the balance at play. You can really see that in his writing here. But he says, it might not be the case all the time, according to my theory, but even if it is really demanding, I still think it's moral that we should do whatever we can to prevent as much suffering as we can without sacrificing something of comparable moral importance. So he's like, it might be demanding, I don't care. That's what is moral. Morality is demanding, essentially. And he also addresses a number of practical objections, which I'm not going to really get into just for the sake of time, but you're welcome to reach out to discuss these further. There's some interesting things in there. There's definitely some things that he's been criticized for in there. But you're welcome to address them in your discussion posts. You're welcome to reach out to me if you want to talk about them further. But I think the last really important claim that he makes that we should discuss is concerns what he calls marginal utility. And so he says there's one way of interpreting his theory. And it's that we ought to be as charitable as we can, give and give and give, work and service, until we reach the level of marginal utility, which he describes as the level at which by giving more, it would cause as much suffering to myself or my dependents, my family, the people that I take care of, as I would relieve by my gift. And so in the case that he's talking about of famine and of refugees in Bengal, what this would require is for people to give and give and give, people in relatively affluent positions or relatively affluent countries, to give and give and give until they're about at an equal level of resource and suffering as someone who is living in a refugee camp. And he says that, this is kind of brought up in some ways as a critique of him, or some people are sort of mentioning this as like, look, this is just too demanding. And he says that the strong version of his argument does kind of require this conclusion that we should give until we reach this level of marginal utility. And he says that is correct, that he is willing to accept that as a conclusion, and also that while the more moderate formulation doesn't require this, once again, he says, I don't see any reason, certainly no moral reason, why we should accept this moderate sort of formulation of this principle over the stronger formulation. Okay, so that is one of Peter Singer's very most famous works, most influential. He's a very influential, at times very controversial philosopher, so he's got a lot of other stuff out there. But this is his one of his sort of canon pieces. And the principles of his argument, I think for a lot of people, feel very intuitive, very basic. So is it bad to die of starvation and lack of medical care and to suffer? People want to say, yeah, that is intuitively bad. Is it good to, would it be morally good to prevent those sorts of bad things from happening as long as you didn't have to give up something of equal moral importance? Yeah, that seems right. But then some of the conclusions involved mean that many of us would have to live our lives in a really extremely different way than we do. So the conclusions are sort of an extreme departure from how most people tend to conduct their lives. And I think that's interesting. So I encourage you all to think about that further, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say in your discussion posts. A lot of this philosophy, there's been a recent movement just socially called the effective altruist movement. And I actually was a student of Peter Singer's who sort of started this movement. If you just type in effective altruism movement into any search engine, you'll find a lot of stuff about it because it's been really popular lately. But that is, I think, all we have for this unit. So I'll look forward to your papers.